This month, July 2025, the portal will be hosting both Jacob Kashir and Matthew Green for a month dedicated to the Resonant Man. And this month in the portal will be part of a Summer at the Portal 2025 work, which will also include a month with Dylan Shaw on the philosophy of theology in August, as well as the introduction of a new sharing circle at the portal led by Rebecca Prentice, titled Sex and Society. There are links in the description if you want to get involved this summer at the portal, and I hope you do. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Rebecca Rose Prentice. Rebecca is going to be starting a new sharing circle in the portal titled Sex and Society, and in this podcast, we're going to be discussing the motivations for this sharing circle. Why are we doing this? What are we hoping to achieve? What are some of the themes we want to explore? And a lot more. So Rebecca is someone who I've been collaborating with in philosophy portal related activities, probably going back to the coronavirus times when I was leading a men's circle. And so I guess our origin of collaboration and connection is in an activity like this anyway. So it makes sense. It's a logical extension of kind of the work, the thoughts, the discussions Rebecca and I have been having for many years now. So I guess with that as a sort of opening and starting point, Rebecca, going into this circle, maybe let's just sort of outline what is Sex and Society so people get a feel for what this project's about.
All right. So, Sex and Society is I'm trying to cultivate a space wherein people are able to think deeply about topics surrounding sex, sexuality, gender, embodiment, and their relationship with like broader social forces and even like say politics. Um, and in such a way as not to just be like, um, very like abstract academic theory head, people about it, but to also like sort of relate that back to their actual lives, their actual experiences, their immediate world around them. So it's an attempt to try to create a space of free association and personal sharing that both connects to some of the most deeply like personal and intimate parts of our lives and of the human experience, while also trying to connect to these more abstract, more philosophically nuanced ideas about the world and about who we are.
So I think this dimension of the everyday, the immediate world with the abstract, the philosophical, that's kind of been a guiding principle for me since perhaps leaving academia is the relationship between the personal and the intellectual. And I've
Mm,
always kind of used it as kind of a guiding principle because I felt like people in academia were so almost insanely disconnected from, let's say, the relationship between their personal lives and their professional lives. And that this kind of weakened potentially both. So, like that the philosophical or the intellectual could be enriched by bringing in more of the personal, and also the other way around, that the personal could potentially be enriched by the philosophical and the intellectual. And I see that as perhaps an embodiment of that drive. How do you make sense of maybe going back to the origin of your work when we were doing the sharing circle, or either the work in the portal or any other related philosophy portal stuff? How do you think these two dimensions can enrich each other, so to speak?
mm. Well, for one thing, I think at least in my case, there's a certain level of what's it called? Apprehensiveness with regards to simply laying out like an abstract intellectual sort of like discourse without being able to sort of find its roots in some kind of experience or some kind of like place where I feel as though I have a concrete relation to the meaning and significance of what's being said. oftentimes, and I get anxious about this because I feel like, oh, am I talking too much about my own life or whatever? And sometimes I am, but uh, it's through this loop of trying to find the connections and associations between the philosophical concepts and ideas in my own life and in the sort of threads that sort of like emerge from that I tend to kind of loop it back around into the concept and idea in order to give it more of a life, both for me in discourse, um, and also I think in its own conceptual life, because you never leave the concept untouched or uninfluenced by the way in which you sort of like um, pull it through the associations that you find in your own life. So I think that both, and not only that, your own life is not unaffected, right? Because the conceptual mediation of your own lived experience sort of opens up avenues for thinking through the nuance and complexity and of one's own life and inner experience. At the same time as doing so sort of gives a certain kind of life to the concept or to the idea that I think otherwise it would not have. Or, I think that living ideas and living concepts have to, in one way or another, um, sort of like all living things, feed off of some sort of like a substance or sustenance. And I think our own lives sort of provide some of that, right, for the development and continued life of a concept.
Now, I think one of the reasons I was initially attracted to psychoanalysis specifically was that I was in my doctorate, I was studying the cognitive sciences, but or even the neurosciences, and I just felt like the way they were approaching the life of the mind was, in a way, radically disconnected from, let's say, living ideas and living concepts. And then, inspired by Freud, of course, you've got free association and you've got the clinic, where it seems like all Freud was interested in was, in a way, living ideas and living concepts, in the sense of people are asked to free associate about their own dreams and their own sexuality and their own, intimate lives, in a way. And that was kind of the symbolic material of the entire investigation. At the same time, the circling work that I've participated in, and I think what the Sex and Society Circle represents, is obviously a different method and a different approach than certainly a clinical psychoanalysis. In your experience, what does circling offer, or what does circling provide that maybe not necessarily an antagonistic with the clinical work, but certainly a more collective, group oriented approach to free association might open up different avenues than a psychoanalytic session?
So a lot of my experience with circling work is with you, as in with Philosophy Portal, as well as having been in the men's group, which is still funny to think about for me. Um, I can't help. I have to, like, I still think it's funny that the men's group ended, and so did my time being a man. Like, I still
Right.
think that's funny.
Yeah.
Um,
Warning for
but
anyone who gets involved in men's work with me, apparently, is like, it might be, you might be brought to the limit of your identity.
yeah. No, but no, it's really it's coincidental. Like I just thought, yeah, it was a coincidence. But anyway, or was it? I don't know. Regardless, the what I think is really interesting about the circling activity, for one thing, is that it gives a place to every person if they so choose to take up that space, and it gives a very solid container for being able to allow speech to flow freely. Um, the and also it's in a way it's still yet safer, also technically in a certain sense, than an actual like analytic session. And so safer and riskier in two different ways. Like, it's safer in the sense that one is not so compelled to go all the way, right? To say everything, right? There are some things you still wouldn't say. You're in a group full of people, right? It's still public. It's a permeable public. It's a pseudo public. It's not entirely public, but it is public enough that there's a certain limits on speech, which are actually helpful. Like you're not going. You hope we would hope that people joining the circle don't drive themselves to the absolute pit of anxiety and despair, and um, and at the same time, uh, it's very open and freeing for the ability to sort of uh, say whatever comes to mind, because normally when you're in a conversation and you're in a dialogue, right, there's a back and forth, there's a kind of like the influence of the receiving end that is not open, that's closed. There's certain, I have to address your question, right, I have to address the topic in a very straightforward way. And when given the space to sort of just share and free associate, one is able to uh, just allow what comes to you to come up and come out. And there are connections that can be made in that way that I think would be missed, right? In a situation where one is much more directed or focused. Trying to think too. Hmm. What else? Because I feel like that doesn't really cover it all.
What I've been trying to think about, maybe I could just give a reflection that might
Mm,
provoke something further, is I've always been inclined to think about the historicity of psychoanalysis, meaning that the time in which psychoanalysis was developed, we were living in a very neurotic society where I feel like people were looking for outlets from family and community, where people
mhm,
were looking for like a more private analytic experience where they could vent about the things that they can't talk about with their wife or their husband or their mother or their father or their community at large. Whereas I feel like now we either live in, there's debates whether we live in a more psychotic society or whether we live in a more perverted society, but it's certainly a society in which I feel like a lot of people are feeling like the breakdown of family and community, and they're living in a much more individualized or individuated existence, and that people are actually looking for maybe a more collective work, like how do I speak freely in the context of building social links instead of
mhm,
maybe distancing myself from social links. So I think that there's something there in like the spontaneous resources and the spontaneous practices that I've gravitated towards, even if sort of the academic or intellectual material on psychoanalysis I found is invaluable, because we've learned so much from just investigating the unconscious mind. And at the same time, it seems like we're in a much different time than Freud's.
yeah, I think that that's a really good point. That today it's not so much that people feel like they're looking for that they're in need of a private space to vent about all their frustrations that come out of their social life or their intimate life that they can't share in a social, like, out in the open. Nowadays, it almost feels as though you can take your grievances to online spaces and get clout for it. Like if you know how to word it right. Like even some of the most personal or intimate and tense sorts
Absolutely.
of situations, you can turn into some kind of spectacle that you can actually market your personality
I
on.
see it constantly.
Yeah. So in a way, it's like we live in a society. We live in a society where the personal is like on display in a certain sense, and yet at the same time, it's not really like deep. You know, like it's just a display, right? The personal is on display, but it is just a display. Um,
There's a way in
and
which the very lack of transparency in the venting is itself a kind of defense against real
yeah.
intimacy or finding the right context to precisely explore what this venting might concretely lead to in a positive, constructive sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that the space of the sharing circle is definitely like, you know what, I will say I really feel like would be nice is if it was actually like a ritual for families to have a sharing, something like a sharing circle. Like I feel like that would be like astounding, or even friend groups or something like that. Um, because in the boundaries, the space for intimacy um is like cultivated in a very unique way. And like I feel like there's an irony there, right? Because it's precisely because of, I think, the way that everyone is given their own space, that an uninterrupted space to free associate or to share, that like sorry, I'm having a brain fart. um that in those sorts of moments there is a dealing with also the silence, right, of the group, and there is a dealing there is a kind of like there is a kind of like connection, a quiet connection with others, I almost feel, in that kind of space that is a kind of intimacy. Um, that you don't often get even in socials, like normal social spaces where people are all having fun together or whatever, right, you know. I there is sort of like a there isn't that same kind of relationship to attention with regards to every individual person in the group, and like yeah, that's something I think is valuable in a world where a lot of people aren't even really like sure how to, like aren't even able to like connect with a sense of group feeling or a sense of like social being, you know?
I think people in general are struggling to precisely like this point again, where it's not that people are, say, overwhelmed by the existing social links and connections, but rather that people are unable to even enter social being at all.
Mm.
So there's a way in which the sharing circle can be a way to cultivate the skill of both listening and speaking and balancing that
Mhm.
out. How do you balance the skills of listening and speaking? I was recently talking to Andrew Robinson, who's a member of the portal, and he was talking about how he thought the skills of listening and speaking were key to. He was thinking in a theological context about Holy Spirit, that it's necessary for these higher order social network phenomena. So there can also be a way in which maybe if in a classical analytic clinic you've got the analyst who's this kenotic being who's listening, almost the analyst is a practice of listening, listening and responding in a certain way, while the anal's end is sort of just freely associating to the analyst. That the sharing circle kind of demands both in a way, like both the capacity to freely associate in a group context as well as listen attentively to the other people in the group and actually use the speech of the group itself as kind of curious investigation of the social substance.
Mhm. Wait, I'm sorry. I I I like dropped out for a second. Did you ask me a question?
No, just more reflecting on just the
Okay.
nature of speaking and listening, and
Right,
that
right.
just the sharing circle allows a cultivation of that skill. That it's a in a way, many ways, it's a precious resource that we don't think about too often. Like
Hmm.
what I'm not sure how other people approach it, but for me, what I try to do in conversation is actually when the other person's speaking, I actually do try to be as empty as possible inside myself. So almost any of the resources that I'm drawing on for when I respond, it's literally coming from the living speech of the other person. So I feel
Yeah.
like that's something that can be cultivated in a sharing circle.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's ironic there that just a moment ago, like I was not paying attention precisely
Right.
because like I had a thought and I was not empty, right? I was not able to receive and work on the substance of your speech, right? So like that,
It's very difficult. It's people underestimate how difficult, and I
yeah,
think that the reason we why we underestimate how difficult it is because maybe in previous forms of society it was taken as a given. But if you pay attention to children and the way children speak to each other, they can't be empty for each other. Like they're just competing for who gets to speak next.
yeah,
Like you have a bunch of kids together, and it's like they all want to speak at the same time, and then you recognize that when they speak it's like popcorn, like they just speak or like they vomit out like what they were always already going to say, so like no one actually is listening.
yes, absolutely. And like that continues, right? Like into adulthood. Like obviously there's a little bit more of this holding back and leaving open the space. But like in many circumstances when people like just are hanging out together, it is still this game of popcorn where and like and it's like it's fun, right? It is fun to play the game of popcorn, right? You're like you like one person tells a joke, everyone laughs, and another person is like, "Hello," you know. But the really skilled, even in that context, the really skilled people are still I think working off of what other people are presenting to the group, right? Like the funniest person in the room is always the person who is paying attention to the like language that other people are using and are able to sort of play on that. Like always, always, always. Um,
Absolutely. And it is a skill. It is something that can be cultivated. And I do think that the sharing circle can be a resource for building that skill. And it's an incredibly valuable skill. I think that academics are particularly bad at it in some situations because they build up such an inner discourse of what they know and what they've read, and they're just really excited to communicate that, like what I know and what I've read. Like I know Lacan, like I'll tell you all about the barred subject, and I'll tell you all about the big other, and I'll tell you all about the object patia, and I'll tell you all about how it's structural, and but did you listen to what the other person just said there? Like, and did you respond to what the other person just said there? Right. So there's a way in which, I think it's the skill of being an academic, being intellectual, doing the readings. That's important, but then there's also the question of how do I perform as a subject in a living social substance? And I think the real skill is, what did that person just say? And can I creatively and meaningfully respond to what that person just said so that they feel that I was genuinely listening?
mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
meeting that person where they are, like meeting that person where they are and not imagining that they're where I want them to be.
right. And when that fails too, like it can feel very, very lonely, right? Especially or like very isolating if what you were looking for was connection, right? If all you wanted, I don't know, I'm sure you've experienced this. I feel like everyone who's into like theory or into philosophy has probably experienced this. But like when you are telling someone about these complex ideas, like rarely is it the case that you simply want to lecture them and like have them download the information directly from what I'm saying. No, you want some kind of engagement. And when you hear something like that's cool or something like that, right? And it's like sometimes that's because they weren't paying attention or they weren't really engaging with it. Sometimes it's because they don't have the resources to even be able to approach what they're getting. But regardless, right, there is this kind of like this desire for in speech your what you're saying to be taken up and sort of chewed on a little bit and worked on a little bit and to sort of reappear to you through them in a certain sense, right? Like and when that doesn't happen at all, like obviously there's lots of different reasons for that to fail, like I said. But like there is I don't know about you, but there is a kind of disappointment. There can be a kind of like, oh, like I felt like I wasn't heard, I wasn't understood, I didn't have that connection I wanted, right? And and obviously this is I'm just talking about it with reference to something that maybe people more into like the intellectual mystic whatever kind of like esoteric stuff what they might experience. But this is also true of, like, say you're into sports and you're trying to have a conversation, the other person isn't into sports, and it's like they don't know how to connect, or they don't even want to connect, or you know, because like even if someone knows nothing about what you're talking about, it's easy enough for them to say ask a question, which is the most elementary. And I struggle with this too, like asking a question in the space of not knowing. um like it's the most basic means of working on and through the speech of someone else in a way that isn't just waiting for your turn to say some thoughts you already had, when you don't actually have a coherent thought, or capacity to hold a thought about what they're saying. A question is like the most elementary thing you can provide. um
Well, one of the things that maybe this will sound a little bit left field, but one of the things I've appreciated about meeting Chris Catrone is that he actually frames Marxism as a question rather
mm,
than as an answer. And there's just something liberating about that in speech, that if you feel like someone is kind of lecturing you about what Marxism is and how it provides the answer to capitalist dynamics, that in many ways it kind of creates the illusion that my subject position and the questions I have about my relationship to these big political economic ideas is somehow irrelevant to the context of what's going on. And maybe this is a function of the fact that universities and people within the university model are kind of paid to be content fillers. Like the students are there to be filled with content.
mm,
And I have to fill them with all the content with my discourse. Um, and it does remind me about what Lacan says about discourse and the function of as a social link. And I just want to make that connection with what you were saying about looking for connection. That people don't realize sometimes that what they're actually interested in is not necessarily filling the other people with content, being the person who has all the answers, but actually just looking for connection simply. I actually think that's probably one of the reasons why there is this kind of renewed interest in religion and theology, because people are looking for some deeper connection, um, rather than just being filled up with content in a specific way. Now, of course, you can use religion in that way as well, where you just use religion as another way to fill content. But like the heart of the history of religious practice, I think, is just simply coming together with other people at a common location, and building social links with other people, and sometimes the discourse of a religion can be the mediation for that. Like I remember asking my grandfather's partner towards the end of his life, like, she went to church, I just said, do you believe in Jesus? Are you going there for a specific religious reason? He said, no, I just, my friends go there. We go for coffee after. It it's the main reason. It's the main way I can connect with people in the week, because otherwise I'm just by myself in my apartment. So just that searching for connection, searching for that, so is basically like her sharing circle.
mm,
So I think that in some ways, like, maybe at least part of what this Sex and Society sharing circle is about is finding the others, looking for the people who want to connect in this way, meeting around this specific link, which is, to me, and I'll just throw it back to you, I've been reflecting on how men's work was an important part of my life in between 2016 and 2021. And I think that the reason why men's and women's work is important is because if we are in a space where we're rebuilding society, it makes sense where we would start with sexuality, because that's kind of the origin of our being in a way. Like we are birthed by mothers and fathers, men and women. So it would make sense that you go back to investigating what is sexuality if you're interested in reconstituting society.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I do think that like the idea of like men and women's work is like extremely important, especially like right now. I can't help but think about all of the different ways in which sort of like you see the social forms or archetypes of like the masculine and the feminine kind of like going off the rails under like the like disintegration of the social via like capitalism and um like the general like nihilistic hedonistic like position that modernity, post-modernity maybe even, has kind of left culture in. So there is this like very real disintegration, I feel, of or like fragmentation of aspects of the like what we understood of as being a man or being a woman, and how that's supposed to be socially significant, or how that's supposed to fit into some kind of like greater social order. And you can see how it's sort of like you could see like all the different options like playing out. Like I mean I don't watch Andrew Tate very much, but I was listening to your conversation with Jacob Kirshner, and I was like, whoa, yeah, that's wild. Like they're both sort of like, what is it? Like they're both kind of like um get yours
Cynical
and
pervert.
get out. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, get yours.
Yeah, get yours, get out. Make sure you're on top and don't let, don't care about anyone else. Um, which is, and it's funny, right? Because like you sort of said, they're both in alignment. Like but they're not
Absolutely.
different. They're actually the exact same
Yeah.
subjective position.
Yeah. I just think it's cynical perversion.
Right, right. And the what's it called? The and then you've also got like the other side of things too. You get like I think of like the incel like black pill sort of like mindset that people find themselves in. Um like I know people who've like been very close to that mindset, right? And it's hard to say like is that because there is a lack of initiation into some sense of masculinity? Is it because of deterioration of social conditions, creating like an environment which conditions like a kind of nihilism for people that don't have the like who like is it true that it's because people like don't have like they don't have like they're not pretty or they're not they can't get a good job or something, and so they don't have the social status or whatever. um, or is it also just like it's impossible to meet people? It's like difficult to actually like make any real connections or to establish stable material support for your own life, and so you can't really support relationships with other people. And then there's also the question of like how much are people just like totally withdrawn into their own sort of like world of solipsistic enjoyment. They've withdrawn into the bubble of the algorithm, right? And they're just like baby with their bottle, and their bottle is filled with like hate and resentment too, and um like there's all these questions with regards to the ways in which I'm more thinking about like men, but like I mean there exists also out there the same way that these sorts of a fragmentation and deterioration of social archetypes or like models. Also for women, I'm less experienced with that, having spent most of my life as a man. Um, but I can definitely see that out there too. Um, So the idea of being able to the idea of like coming together as men and as women to think through how to understand themselves and how to relate to their social world, um, I definitely think is like a really important constructive project, especially in the face of like attempts to engage in a reconstructive project that tries to enforce old like standards or old traditional sort of like archetypes and models for sexual identity and sexual relations. And the thing is, right, like none of the attempts to reinstate the old traditional models actually reinstate old traditional models, because in the current moment, in order to create the what appeared to be the traditional models of the past, requires a kind of like force and a kind of manipulation or like distortion in order to bring it into the present that by de facto makes it something else, right? And there is like a certain fear about the level of investment in the more brutal and like uh, constraining aspects of these past models that I think is very concerning. We definitely see, for instance, how like how you like I don't know, you get like tradcath type thing as an example of trying to reinstate some old model of being a man or woman and and their relation. And it looks nice on Instagram, but from what I've heard, right, like it's often not actually as nice as it sounds, or doesn't always end up being as nice as it sounds.
I think these
Um,
are really important points. Well, just I want to emphasize something that's like been key for me is like I do agree with you that it's very important to do this. Well, one, it's important to do this men's and women's work. We should make a distinction that Sex and Society is not specifically about men's and women's work. It's more
right.
about well, exactly what it says, more Sex and Society. So it's not specifically a men's or a women's circle, but it is in the same general category in a way, which maybe with a different boundary for what the work is actually pointing at, which we'll talk about before closing. But I just want to say that men's work and women's work can lead one to this kind of um, old traditional archetype point of view. Like what we need to do is just reinstitute the old traditional archetypes, and I feel like that's actually in many ways the wrong direction of men's work. That's what I've experienced in the past when I've been associated with groups where they came to the conclusion that, well, we just need traditional Catholicism or we just need Orthodox Christianity as the true masculine identity. That's the solution to all of this woke, or this is the solution to the sexual disorientation, or it's a solution to liberal capitalism or whatever. I think that the reason why I resonate with the Resonant Man, who they're coming into the portal this July, is because they're embodying a form of men's work that's more about exploring the subtle emotions and exploring desire in a way that's not trying to close the gap, but they're kind of open to, they would say, like an emergent field, like an emergent social field through the gap. And what masculinity is and what femininity is itself open to be explored in a new time in a new place. So of course we're not again a men's or a women's circle, but we are kind of sharing, I think, that principle of opening up a space where we're curious about desire.
Mm,
We're curious about subtle emotion. We're curious about how do we learn to become better speakers and listeners in this intimate field
mm.
where we don't know where the archetypal identification is going to emerge. But yeah, is there anything there that you think is relevant to communicate about specifically what you hope Sex and Society might become?
Yeah. So I think of so if I almost want to say that if men and women's work is an open exploration that aims at being more constructive, I think that what is going on here does not necessarily aim to be like deconstructive. Don't get me wrong. Like I think we've had plenty of deconstruction in the past. Although maybe some things could still be, deconstructive. Um, but more so, it's I think about uh, opening up the space of exploring um, like not just like masculinity and like femininity, or of trying to construct an archetypes, or trying to explore how to embody those things, but about relating those experience back to questions of, I guess you could say, relating those questions individually, personally, back to sort of, I guess you could say, the antagonisms or complications, contradictions um, that emerge at different levels of the, I guess you could say, like the social, like, and conceptual mediation of those subtle emotions, of those desires, of like identity, um, and kind of being able to kind of in a more abstract way. Like I don't know exactly what things are like in some of the, like some of those circles. I remember our circle, but I feel like this will be more topical. It's more relating to certain to a particular idea, presenting an idea, and then sort of like working on that idea through our own experiences of sex, of gender, of sexuality, of the relationships we have with people, intimate and also like of a friendly, like, you know, like the relationships between the platonic relationships between men and women, platonic relationships between men and men, between women and women, like those are also fascinating, and those don't always get talked about enough too, which is really, I think, a really important thing to present. um and also, where you have those friendships, you basically have some form of society, right? And in its most elementary form. So like my part of my idea behind some of this is that like you really can't escape the relationship between sex and society, or maybe the non-relationship, we could say, if we want to get play around on that. Um, and that if we, whether we're talking about the social or we're talking about sex at the personal level or at the more like abstract conceptual level, I think we end up sort of coming around like a mobius strip like kind of structure here. Like you end up, you go along one far enough, you're going to end up on the other. If you go far enough into like the abstract high conceptual stuff, you're going to end up at the concrete personal experience. If you go far enough on thinking about the sexual, you're going to end up in the social, and vice versa, you know, for both. And it's kind of playing on that sort of unorientability of those two things, um, that I think I want to like focus on, right, with the group. Now, I will say there is also this question for me, like, I mean, I'm transgender, and there is a question of like some contemporary issues around gender and sexuality that are of particular interest to me. I don't think I'm going to like I don't think I want to like make that the center of how what I want to sort of revolve around here. But it is something that I still think is of relevance when we think about this one, the sort of like liberal, pluralistic, polymorphous kind of like sexuality and identity kind of like don't like tendencies in society. And when you think of this sort of like conservative, traditionalist sort of pushback that you're seeing, right? And so like that's a big one. That is a big tension in society, of which I am personally like, I'm implicated. My very being, my future medical health insurance, right, is implicated in this sort of like tension. And so, you know, that is something I think is definitely worth exploring. But once again, like, it's about more about those mobius strips between the personal and the abstract, and between the or conceptual, and between the sex and society, and the different like places where those the tensions of disorientability emerge. That really is where I want to be the focus. And so, in that sense, like there is going to be relation to stuff like men's work and women's work, right? But definitely more focused on particular like points of tension, I think.
So going into that was great, by the way. going into our first Sex and Society circle this July 9th, and then August and on throughout the year, what are some of those tension points? Or you already mentioned, for example, the big one, right, between more liberal, polymorphous, pluralistic versus conservative, traditional pushback, and the way in which you're implicated as a singularity in that. I think that's a great window into what these sessions will offer is a space to think through these tensions, which often do not only define people's lives and identities, but have deep political ramifications for like you say, access to healthcare and things like that. What are some of the other tension points that are alive for you in thinking about sex and society and your initial sort of approaches to leading some of these sessions?
Um, so let's see. Well, the first session I'm planning to just focus on the meta sort of structure of the project, which is like that, like I've mentioned, that kind of Mobius strip of sex and society, which I think is a good place to start. And it gives us a basic procedure for how to like work on some material in other contexts. Um, and but for going beyond that, I mean, there's a couple that I think are the obvious ones, which is thinking about identity more broadly, right? Thinking about identity as it relates to and that's the thing, I'm always running into this. Like there's always like layers. There's always so many layers and like ways that things split off, right? Because I want to say thinking about identity and sex, but then what does sex mean, right? Like sex can mean sexuality, sex can mean anatomy, and then sex gets associated with gender too. But I think that when we talk about gender, we're really talking about discursive kind of like social practices, right? Um, but like identity is something that's both personal and also social. It's something that's also in like imminently always sort of being disturbed, right? Like our sense of identity is always running into the limits of its own ability to actually represent like some essence of who we are or some idea that we think of ourselves as being. And so it's like constantly subject to various kinds of reinterpretations, openings, collapsings, and that for almost everyone, their sense of identity has some relationship on some level to both like desire, sexuality. When I say and like sex, desire and sex in the in more like psychoanalytic sense is you really open up broadly, like the way that this stuff can like be explored. But like in the more basic sense, there's like, oh, I want to have a family. I am this type of person that I want to have kids, or that I want to have a wife, or that I want to whatever. And all of these things which are deeply entangled with their desire and with their sense of self are also intimately shaped by the kind of society in which they live. It's also limited by the type of the society in which they live, right? Like maybe you can't have a family, maybe you can't be that cowboy, maybe like you're not gonna be you're not gonna be a gangster, and so like, or you're not gonna be a supermodel, and so there's these limits you run into.
It was shattering for me when I realized I couldn't be a cowboy or a gangster. It's just like I had to deal with the total breakdown, transcendental illusion of my whole being.
But I mean, like it is like
Yeah, yeah. But that's important. Like I was talking recently with a guy about the breakdown of ego ideals. He was thinking about like why can't we constitute ego ideals today? That's what he's struggling with. And I think there's something deep in that because ego ideals is connected to sublimation. So if we don't have ego ideals, we can't sublimate. So if we don't have ego ideals, we're just kind of stuck in the immediacy, and we're stuck in cynicism, and we're stuck in perversion because we can't build something that actually functions over a lifetime, right? So there's these There's ways in which, but at the same time, I think we spontaneously want to construct ego ideals. I think people struggle because perhaps of the unorientableness, because of the inability to work with some of the things that we're going to be exploring in the Sex and Society circle, that I think we need to have almost a more reflective approach to constructing ego ideals, unless the ego ideal becomes too brittle, and too simple. Like, for example, the LARPing of I'm going to be a trad wife, or I'm going to be, you know what I mean? I'm going to be a trad. Like
Right.
these things are attempts to construct ego ideals, but they're ultimately too brittle, too fragile, too out of touch with the real social substance of our time. So ultimately, they might point in a interesting direction, or even have a correct intuition. But unless they have, I think, a type of space like Sex and Society, then they're not going to be able to become, let's say, anti-fragile to the moment and to a lifelong process.
Mm-hmm. And I think like I wonder if you agree. Part of like the key for these sorts of models, uh, I'm always unsure about the term ego ideal, but it sounds like this is what I'm referring to when I'm saying the cowboy or um, like part of the key to it, I think of its anti-fragility is I think recognizing within it that its own sort of like empty core, its own kind of, and being able to relate to that negativity as something that means that it's
Absolutely.
right. Its capacity to evolve with you and to also not overdetermine you is like part of the way that you relate to that kind of like thing, right?
The problem is the way in which people substantialize it and internalize it in some naive way, instead of seeing it as kind of like an avatar of their own lack.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
Because
then it
if it's an
becomes
avatar of
like,
your own lack, it can be something that's constantly evolving in
yeah,
a continuity with the rest of your life, as opposed to something that should be substantially real. And if it's not completely embodied, then there must be some ultimate crisis and so forth. And also
right.
it can be, again, kind of like a just become a LARPing, which I would take to be where the ego ideal is taking primacy over the context of the relations in which it's actually embedded.
Mhm. I feel like on some respect, like I just would love to like tie that back for a second to like gender and gender identity because I feel as though right like what's weird is at the same time as we've had like a breakdown in some sense of the traditional norms, maybe we could say, of like being a man or a woman, like we have like almost like unbelievably intense and simplified ideas about what being a man or woman is now, even in people's rejection of them, even in people's rejection of those ideals, like like and the thing is like I think that very few people actually embody them, like and they're mostly inconsistent, they're hazy, inconsistent, sort of like ghostly apparitions that just sort of hang over people. Like I think that like a lot of men and women exist in like a very fragile relationship to some really oppressive but really indistinct idea of what it means to be a man or a woman.
Very caricatured. These can be like the ultimate caricatures, like a Andrew Tate, or I mean,
Mm-hmm.
but these do function as ego ideals for people, or even Jordan Peterson, right? Like they can become the daddy of the internet or something like that. Like, but it's, like what a man is a very disciplinary figure, um, for example, or I mean, Andrew Tate is. It's almost too tempting of a caricature with the what being a man is that I'm have complete independence, and I've got many Ferraris, and I'm at the club and all the women are interested in me, and I have and I'm at, and on my free time I'm at a gun range.
But then
you
also
know
what's fascinating is the way people will also try to form an ego ideal in opposition to this like really like obscure caricature, or this really inconsistent caricature. And like, oh, I'm not gonna be like, so a guy can be like, think of this really oppressive masculine caricature and be like, oh, I'm not going to be that. And at the same time, sort of lose certain elements like they end up drawing certain associations like, oh, masculinity is like aggressive and intense and whatever, right? And can try to be more like soft spoken and meek and sensitive, and then and in a weird way they form like another caricature, a different caricature that's also like built off of an opposition of an already bad caricature. I think women will sometimes do this too, where it's like, oh, a woman is like, like a pretty subordinate, uh, docile, listens to what other people say, doesn't cause a problem, and then try to be, and either like they might try to live up to that, maybe, or they might even try to oppose it and be like, no, I'm going to be very like aggressive and assertive
Yeah.
and insensitive, and I'll be like made of steel, and I'm gonna like be super proactive about everything, and like that becomes an intense pressure too, right? Like,
I think what we're
so,
talking about is the dialectics of sexuality and sexual identity itself. That there can be
mm,
very simple oppositional modes which people will identify in a non-dialectical way, and yeah, these things are way too simple reifications, and they're not sort of the actual complexity and mess of our real lives in a full sense. And I think in that spirit, like there's been language throughout our entire conversation so far of non-relation, ego ideals, sublimation, um, unorientableness, where we are coming from. We're not going to be, again, dogmatic in any certain way, but there is kind of a theoretical backbone to this group, and will be informing kind of the sessions you set up. And also at Philosophy Portal, we've done work, for example, on Alenka Zupancic, What is Sex book, and other inspirations. But in terms of, well, we did whole course on Lacan's Cree and stuff, so there's very much a psychoanalytically informed group here in a way. But how do you see the ideas you're going to be setting up for these sessions as informed by various traditions, or maybe specific traditions?
so I definitely think that one of the major influences that's going to inform how we proceed with this and how I think through some of the prompts and topics and ideas that we'll be exploring definitely come from Alenka, from What is Sex? Um, there's just this really beautiful there's this really amazing part in the introduction to What is Sex that actually goes into the notion of sex as contradiction, but not as a contradiction of two fully, like, I guess you could say, complete and coherent uh, terms or things, but as a contradiction that I wish I could remember how to word this. She puts it so well. But that where the very things in contradiction are also in part determined by that contradiction. So they're not in advance clear and distinct. They're in a process of clarifying themselves in relation to each other, and in that way also disturbing each other, right? So this notion of contradiction, this ontological metaphysical kind of like notion based on which obviously comes with a kind of epistemological what would you call that, epistemological difficulty, um informs a lot of my ideas about thinking about this like really basic idea of difference, which is difference that not only sits at the level of like not just between, say, ontological categories or something like that, but the also the difference that emerges once you even begin to think about the ontological. Like, um, I'm almost I'm struggling here, but I think one of the things I would point to is just looking at the excess of enjoyment in discourse or within the discursive field, um, and the way that this can sort of like it gets caught in its own kind of like loop or its own kind of like maybe we could say superstructure, um, that parasitizes on signification and the signifying order. And the way that that sort of excess is linked to drive and linked to desire has like right is that more fundamental psychoanalytic has psychoanalytically informed conception of like the root of like sex or sexuality, and like the very like excess that sort of seems to emerge from and also like precede the like the discursive, like that difference already is like this difference of the of sex, which I think is interesting to think about, like to think about that it even going back as far as the origin of like the subject and the subject's emergence in language, its own sort of excess and contradictions. Now all that's really really abstract and obscure, right? On if I were to try to talk to most people about that and try to relate that back to sexual identity, sexuality, man and women, whatever. Like it's a long road to get from that highly abstract psychoanalytic
Right.
philosophical concept of sex back to the more concrete everyday lived experience of what it means to be sexed biologically, discursively in terms of gender, and even at the level of like sexuality and desire. Like it seems so alien from those things to think about like this other like thing Alenka's doing. But I do think they're like they're deeply related. And but one of the ways I feel like to draw on another conceptual resource, one of the ways, at least when talking about gender, that I think is an interesting entry point is, I mean, it's been beaten to death, but like Judith Butler is definitely interesting. Like the thinking about the discursive field specifically, if we were to bracket out some of the other elements of thinking about sex and people's the social and people's identities, like the repetition of a performance which generates the illusion of an inner sort of like metaphysical essence, um, and its own subject to failure as it repeats, and sort of like that openness that's created for its like becoming. uh that's like that core essential idea in Butler, I feel like is so easily passed over and so easily forgotten when people talk about performativity. Like, oh, it's just performance, oh, it's performativity, whatever. Like, it's like, but no, there is like a real like there. If she's right, there is that metaphysical illusion that is generated through the repetition of performativity. Like, is not nothing. Like, that is actually substantially valuable, especially with how it might fit into larger structures of like social meaning and of social organization. So like that's another sort of important thing I think that's worth thinking about, and its own sort of imminent internal contradiction and failure. Obviously, I also think that trying to get back to a little bit of Freud, I need to reread. I need to read some more Freud. I need to read 3 essays on theory of human sexuality. I think that would be essential.
Classic.
That should be like high priority for me. Um,
Yeah.
like I think that that's also an important thing to dig into. Um,
So this
I
is
think
going to be a circle that brings together the deep theory and also the everyday and the trying to learn how to stumble towards the connections between these realms.
yes, yes,
Well,
that's the goal.
you gotta get on the 3 essays. Hopefully the 3 essays can be something that informs a future Sex and Society session. And our first session will be July 9th, and we'll be repeating every month, and there'll be a link in the description for anyone who wants to investigate and find more. Could you let people know how people can get involved in Sex and Society? I'll just say on my side that all members of the portal will just get open access to Sex and Society, but there are two other ways to get involved. So why don't you let them
So,
know how they can do that?
yes. There is I've created a Sex and Society Patreon and a Sex and Society Substack. On the I'll probably I'm gonna be making articles that's gonna be free. And I think I'll be putting that on both the Patreon and the Substack. But on either one of those, if you join for as little as like a cup of coffee, like $5 a month, you'll get access to the sharing circle and on the monthly regular. Um, if people want to donate more than, or if people want to, yeah, if people want to help me out with more than $5, I would love that. Super cool. Like, hats off to you. But all that's as little as you need. So, um, yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting involved myself, and I think the idea of men's and women's work has been important to me, but at the same time, I do think both men's and women's work points towards what Sex and Society is, which is again more of this tarrying with the antinomy of Sex and Society itself in an unorientable way. And I think that that is a way in which we can enrich philosophy. I am of the opinion that whatever future philosophy emerges in the 21st century, it has to wrestle with some of the questions that come out of psychoanalysis. And I see Sex and Society as potentially a laboratory that's pointing in that direction as well, which is why I'm excited to have it be a part of the Philosophy Portal project. But for anyone who's going to get involved, again, July 9th, we start. Rebecca, is there any final thought or final word you want to leave the viewers with, someone who's thinking about getting involved?
So I would say that if you're thinking about getting involved, like the number one thing I can say is that if you like, I know most people watching this or being or interested in this will probably be people into theory, into psychoanalysis, into philosophy, into sociology, um, or into like spiritual self work and all that kind of stuff is the more likely audience to this. But I just want to say, if you are not familiar with the kind of theoretical background that I have discussed here or that we work with here, that should not deter you from getting involved. I really truly believe that it is that like you we all have like an intuitive sense of some of these ideas, and our own lives are filled with these experiences that circle around these topics, these tensions, and these ideas. And if you're interested in exploring that, regardless of what kind of theoretical background you have, academic background you have, spiritual background you have, if you are interested in exploring that space with us, don't hold yourself back because you worry about whether or not you'll fit in or whether or not you'll be able to keep up. Because I assure you that the space is a space for you to share, and you will learn if you listen. So that's all you need.
Rebecca Rose Prentice with Cadell Last. Sex and Society starts July 9th, and hope you join us this month, July 2025. The portal will be hosting both Jacob Kashir and Matthew Green for a month dedicated to the resonant man. And this month in the portal will be part of a Summer at the Portal 2025 work, which will also include a month with Dylan Shaw on the philosophy of theology in August, as well as the introduction of a new sharing circle at the portal led by Rebecca Prentice, titled Sex and Society. There are links in the description if you want to get involved this summer at the portal, and I hope you do.